parking brake adjustment for all generations of Miata in this video. A little bit of a Miata basic how-to, if you will. So throughout this video, I'm going to have some examples. I'm going to show you how to make those adjustments, talk about the tools that are needed, all of that kind of stuff. This is going to be pretty straightforward, but if you have questions along the way, please drop those in the comments below. We do read all of your questions and try to answer them throughout the video live. And of course, if you're commenting later after this video has been posted to Facebook and YouTube, we will be answering those questions after the fact as well. We read all of the comments. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Talking about parking brakes, this video is mostly going to be about NA and NBs. And uh-oh.
What?
Hold on.
Easy fix. Potential.
Technical.
Okay. So
All right.
check the test.
Microphone now. Can you hear me? Check, check.
Could be after that.
Still a different microphone. Hello, testing this stuff out. 1, 2, 3.
Really?
Can you reset this?
No? That should have worked. Worked it in before.
Not the other mic on the table? Okay. Testing, testing. Hello, check, check, check. This is my best radio announcer voice. Can you hear me now? Any difference? You can hear me? Hey!
All right.
All right, excellent. Okay. Our apologies, technical difficulties. I'll do a brief restart there. We're going to talk about brake adjustments, specifically parking brake adjustments on Miatas. Now, this video will cover all NA, NB, NC, and ND adjustments, and we'll kind of go through them in stages. Most of it will be about NAs and NBs because they do have the most available adjustment. So that being said, since it was probably hard to hear earlier, please drop any comments down below if you have any questions about the processes. This will be a pretty basic how-to for all generations, but if I miss anything, feel free to call it out or ask questions in the comments, and we'll try to answer those live as I'm doing the video. Anything that doesn't come through or comes through after the video, we will also answer those after this video has been put in the widescreen 4K version on YouTube tomorrow. So, without further ado, parking brakes. Everybody knows, or at least has heard of parking brake, emergency brake. You know, there's a few different names for it, but basically it all means on stock cars that you have a caliper in the rear that not only is it going to be squeezing the pads with hydraulic pressure, but it also has some kind of a mechanical mechanism that it's going to be able to actuate to also squeeze those pads. So that way you can leave a car parked with this parking brake or emergency brake activated, and you don't have to have your foot or something else pressing the hydraulic brake pedal underneath the dash. Pretty straightforward. This is basically a mechanism that some people use a lot of people don't use at all, and it's okay. But the other thing that we get questions about is how do we adjust it? So most of that is going to be what we're talking about today, but before we get into the actual adjustment procedure on the car, let's talk about some of the actual parts on the calipers to familiarize yourself with what to look for. Here in front of me I have some calipers. These two are actually from a NB sport brake car. The NA6, NA8s, and early NB1s, they have very, very similar setups. Yours might just look a little bit different, and that's okay. But for all of them, basically, you're going to have your main caliper body, right? You have your bleed screw. This would normally be your brake line. And then on the back, you have this spring and kind of hinge setup. So what we're looking for on this doesn't have your parking brake cable, which would attach from here to here. But what we're looking for is this bolt right here. So this is actually the access for how to adjust your parking brake, the actual mechanism within the caliper itself. Like I mentioned earlier, all we're doing is we're trying to get this piston to clamp the pads against the rotor. So it needs another method besides hydraulic pressure to be able to push that piston forward into the pads to clamp the rotor. So this mechanical lever motion, maybe if I put it down and not wiggle it around, you can kind of see that it moves a little bit there just by actuating that lever. See how it's pushing that piston out? It doesn't move a lot, and it's not supposed to, because it's trading off this motion for a little bit of movement here, but a lot of effort, a lot of clamping force. So that adjustment, because there's not a lot of movement here at the piston, it needs to be pretty dialed in. Otherwise, your parking brake either won't work much at all, or you might actually have your brakes dragging all the time to where your parking brake doesn't disengage fully and you drive down the road and your rear brakes are smoked because you have too much adjustment. So there's obviously a happy medium that we need to hit when we're making these adjustments. So back here to the back side of the caliper, this little bolt, not this one, this is the one that holds on this bracket, but this little guy, it's kind of a thin bolt head. Oops, sorry, I'm moving out of screen. This thin bolt head right here, it is a 14 millimeter. And if we remove that guy, there is actually access to the backside of the caliper here. Now, I've removed it already, but normally you would see this, a little Allen keyway deep down in there. And this is an adjustment screw, so that way you can actually make an adjustment inside the caliper to set that distance, or basically the taking up the slack, if you will, if there is any, with this adjustment. This little guy is a spline screw, and you can see it's just straight splines all the way around. And it has a 4 millimeter Allen keyway in the back, so that's what you would use to actually access this. So this guy, when it's inside here, I usually use either an Allen key, or I like to use an Allen socket just because they're a little easier. But you use that to turn, to turn this spline inside the caliper, and there is a kind of a pinion style screw that's on the inside of here that this is moving or turning against, and that will position this piston further out or retract it in. Now, you need to be able to access both directions, of course, so you can turn it either way. If you're changing your pads and you put in new pads that are thicker, you need to retract that piston so that way you can actually put the pads in there. So you can use this to be able to retract the piston, get the pads in there, and then when you're all done, which I'll show you in a minute, you can push this back out to where it's set to be just ready to be able to engage when you lift your parking brake lever and actually clamp onto the rotor. But this adjustment here is basically where all of the magic happens. Now, these guys are notorious, if you've ever done this before, that they can be difficult to turn. And a lot of times that's because the bolt that basically covers this up is either missing, or it's been out many times, and then whoever put it back last, they forgot the crush washer, just like this one. This doesn't have a crush washer, and it should. And it's not because there's normally fluid in here, but you want to keep all of the dirt and debris out. So oftentimes they do get filled up with crud, yuck stuff, and of course, if you've got a bunch of debris in these splines when you're trying to turn it, it's going to get all bound up. So what will happen oftentimes is that it's difficult to turn, or in worst case scenarios, this one you can actually see it's starting to happen. You can actually shear the splines because it's just so bound up, or there was something that got caught between this spline and the threads on the inside, and it starts to just tear away at the adjuster. These little guys are difficult to find unless you usually just get a whole replacement caliper. You cannot buy just this little piece from Mazda. I've already looked. So if you are going to be doing any kind of maintenance to your parking brake system on an NA or NB, plan on taking this guy out. I usually just, if I've already taken the caliper off, kind of hold it like this, take my Allen and just kind of wiggle it around in there and try to see if I can get it to come out. Sometimes they're so loose that they just fall out. Other times they're kind of gummed up, so it may take a little bit of working. But once I have it out, use a brush, scrape it off, spray a little bit of brake clean in there, Q-tip, clean it all out. And it is a good practice because it is moving parts, moving metal pieces, engaging with each other. Put a little bit of brake caliper grease on these splines before you put it back in there. Just give it as good a shot as possible at still being able to turn and not get bound up and give you problems where once this gets any worse than this, it becomes unusable. I've seen them so bad that they shear in half, and then this half of the spline is stuck in there, and then you can't adjust your caliper at all. So if it starts feeling like it's really bound up and too tight, stop what you're doing and see if you can clean it out and get that spline tool out of there, because it would be better to buy a used caliper that you can hopefully scab the little spline drive out of to replace yours than to have to worry about replacing the caliper altogether if you can help it. So, word to the wise on the NAs and Bs, they're all this style. Keep an eye out for that. The other good thing though is that your car is equipped with 2 of these calipers, left and a right. So if you do get one that's bunged up and you manage to get it out, you can steal the one out of the other side to do your adjustment temporarily and then go back to the other side and use it, as long as you can pull it out from either end. So you kind of have at least 1 out of 2 chances, if you do it that way, to be able to do your adjustment. So in a nutshell, that's how the caliper setup, the physical parts are for NAs and NBs. I'm going to briefly jump over to NCs and NDs because they are quite a bit different, actually. This caliper in front of me is an ND caliper. The NC rear calipers look very, very similar. You'll notice that the construction looks pretty much the same. It's a bracket and claw, one, kind of a puller style caliper, you might say. And it does have some little hooks back here. It does have a spring. So, other than looking a little bit different, it is basically the same style setup for how a cable would be pulling this together to actuate and move the piston. Same for the NAs and NBs, right? The difference is that you start looking around and there's no little bolt or access to get to the back of the caliper. So that way you can actually get to the adjustment for the piston to move it, advance it out or to retract it into the caliper body. And that's because these pistons are kind of a special piston in that, one, they look different. You can visually tell they've got this kind of crosshatch pattern here, or cross pattern, I suppose. And that's a big differentiator compared to the NA and Bs, where they just have kind of a round circular piston face. But what this means and why it's this way is because these pistons actually are intended to rotate to be able to retract or extend further out. So to do that, maybe to stop holding that guy and show you a little bit easier, to do that, there's a tool. There's actually a little brake tool. Oftentimes you see them at parts stores. They look like a little cube with kind of pointy bits on some ends, but it interfaces with this kind of like a screwdriver, honestly, and you use that to be able to turn and rotate the piston inside the caliper itself. And that action basically turns it into a screw. And it may be hard to see on film, but inside here, this is a mechanism on the inside of the piston that's basically got female threads, and it interfaces with a big stud on the inside of the caliper that it allows it to, when it turns, it's actually threading in or out on that stud inside the caliper. So that adjustment, you're actually threading it in or out to be able to meet your pads, or if you're retracting them to replace pads, whatever. So that is the mechanism to be able to set your parking brake at the caliper when you're doing pads. The other trick thing about NCs and NDs and why there isn't any other adjustment after the fact is that these guys also feature a ratcheting mechanism. So once you've swapped your pads or whatever it is you're doing, and you have that piston retracted all the way into the caliper, when you have everything bolted back on the car and you press your brakes a few times and then you pull your parking brake lever a few times, it will push itself out, meet the pads, and basically it'll retract slightly, but it has a ratcheting feature that once you do that, it will basically live right there. So it will extend as far as it needs to without you having to manually set that adjustment for it to be just right there ready to push those pads to squeeze the rotor. So it's a very clever design. A lot of modern cars that use a claw style or puller style caliper nowadays, this is the kind of tech that they use. It's pretty, I wouldn't say idiot proof, but it really makes the job a lot easier because you don't have to worry about making sure you have the adjustment with your little spline tool and that you have it just right, because it's all manually done, which again, I'll show you in just a bit. So the technology for the NCs and NDs is much simpler for the parking brake. So this, again, pretty simple in how it does it, just a little bit more automated for the actual mechanism to make your life a little easier. If you don't have that little cube that I was mentioning earlier to be able to turn this, there's a few different other tools. I'm sure that South American Jungle Company online probably has a few different options if you wanted to. But I've even used, just like if you've got a scraper tool to scrape gaskets and stuff that you can use to turn these as if it was a big screwdriver. It's the same. So if you don't have the right tool, this one's a pretty easy one to use a not correct tool to be able to retract that piston into the caliper so you can change your pads. Easy peasy. Okay, that's the stock calipers in a nutshell. NCs and NDs are very, very similar. I could show you an NC one, but it honestly looks almost the same. So stepping away from the stock calipers, let's talk about aftermarket options for just a second. So over here, I've got some of our Wilwood options where we have a few different flavors. And basically for these guys, of course, these are our Wilwood kits. If you have a different brand of aftermarket brake kit, this may or may not apply. But since we're going to talk about our brake kits, Wilwood is what we carry. For the rear of any 4 of these generations, basically, it's going to be this one and then these 2 options for NAs and NBs. So we'll start over here on this particular one, since this is the most common. This is a power light caliper, and you can see that we have a couple of parking brake arms that are poking out here, and then this cable. So this is a very simple setup where you can see the rotor turning in there. There would normally be pads on either side here, and when I pull the cable, I don't know if I'll be strong enough to do it here on the bench. Not really. I don't have enough mechanical advantage. But you can see if I move it around here, the arms, they would pinch together, they'd pinch the pads, which then pinches the rotor. It's a very basic mechanical setup. This is also why this, because it's just squeezing pads like this, rather than having mechanical advantage of basically a lever arm to pull together, this style of caliper doesn't have as strong a parking brake effort as the stock calipers. But it's a much simpler mechanism, it's very lightweight, and the benefit here, at least at the caliper, is there's no adjustment needed at the caliper. We'll show you the adjustment inside the car in a little bit, but this is very simple. There's no real mussing or futzing around with the parking brake setup. Once you have it hooked up, you're done here at the caliper. Easy. Moving on to this style, this is our dual caliper setup where we have a power light, again, for hydraulic purposes only. But then up here we have the Wilwood Spot caliper, I believe is what it's called. And this guy is for parking brake purposes or emergency brake only. And you can see here around back, it has a very similar lever style parking brake mechanism where you would hook up your parking brake cable, and this actually just uses a stock style parking brake cable right here. And this lever moment is also doing a similar function to the stock ones, where it's turning the mechanism in here that pushes the caliper, pushes the piston out to squeeze the pads, to squeeze the rotor. So this style has a very strong parking brake-like factory. Of course, it is more complex, so there's a little bit more going on here, but the procedure to adjust this is very similar to NAs and NBs, just a little bit different with different tools. So on this one, Logan, you might want to come around back here actually, just because it'll be easier to see what's going on. On this one, instead of having a spline drive where it's internal, this actually has a threaded shaft with a hex. This is a 6mm hex poking out the back, and then you have a 1/2-inch nut. This is Wilwood, so that does use some Imperial stuff. But basically, this is a guy where you would take your 6mm, hold on here, and then loosen it. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. There we go. There you go, loosen the nut. And then you can use your 6mm to thread in your adjustment screw to the point where you can just feel it starting to be difficult to turn. Basically, that means that your piston is now pushing against the pads, against the rotor. And now I can't turn that rotor. So once you reach that point, basically reverse the rotation and turn this one whole rotation around like that. And then I should be able to rotate this rotor freely. And once you're happy with that, everything feels good, it's not dragging, then you just hold it in place. Whoops, I just undid it, sorry. I'm doing the wrong procedure. Okay, so one turn, there we go. So now all I'm going to do is hold the stud in place, and I'm going to tighten the nut. And that is the adjustment set, easy peasy. So now we have the rotor that's able to turn, and we have basically that piston is right up against the back of the pad, ready to engage as soon as you pull the lever. And pretty straightforward, and again, a little easier to access because everything's external. On the next one down, this is a dual caliper setup with a separate handbrake, but I won't call it a parking brake. This one is actually a hydraulic brake as well. So regular power light, but this is used for normally drift purposes, or if you are going to be doing any kind of stunt driving, I suppose you could say. So this is a secondary caliper that is also hydraulic. It doesn't use any kind of mechanical leverage at all. You would have a separate handbrake and hydraulic system for that, so that way you can initiate skids and slides and that kind of thing with this setup. We're not going to talk about that in this video because that's a whole different can of worms. We're mostly concerned about the mechanical style parking brakes today. Before I move on to doing anything else on the car, do we have any comments, questions that I should talk about? Do we have a lot?
There's a couple.
Oh, okay.
Someone asked, is the handbrake the same across all versions? If not, what is different?
Is the handbrake the same across all versions?
Probably the adjustment, I imagine, is what they're asking.
Oh, okay. So it is the adjustment procedure. Basically, if your question is the adjustment at the handbrake the same across all 4 gens? Almost. It is very, very similar. We'll look at that a little bit later. Anything else?
Kind of. Someone else is asking, can third-party brake calipers be modified to use the parking brake in a manner the same as OEM?
Can third-party calipers be used?
Yeah, like Wilwood calipers, be modified to use the factory parking brake?
Be modified to use the factory parking brake?
Yeah, I think that's what they're asking.
I'm not sure if that's exactly what we're asking here, but if you're basically, can I use the factory handbrake with aftermarket calipers? Absolutely. So these kits don't change the parking brake handle inside the car. It does need to be adjusted, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, this setup, the dual caliper, this uses the factory parking brake cable. And this setup, for any of the 4 generations, we actually provide slightly different cables because they have different ends to be able to use these squeezy arms. So we provide new cables that will then work with all of the bits inside the car, so that way when you pull the stock parking brake handle, these still work as intended. Hopefully that answers your questions. If that's not what you meant, maybe type us a little bit more thorough question and I'll come back to it. Okay, anything else for now?
Nope.
Okay, so now that we've talked about the parts pieces, I've shown you what it looks like off the car, let's look at it on the car so that way you can have a little bit better idea of what we're actually doing in situ. So here behind me, I have a 2000 Miata. I pulled the wheel off already. This has stock brake calipers, and basically this is pretty normal for what you'd see on NAs and NBs. Remember that there's a little bit of difference in the caliper size and the rotor size depending on which NA or NB you have, but they're all basically the same style caliper. You can see also I've got the parking brake cable on this. It's still actually connected and hooked up that we couldn't see on the table. And there is some adjustment here that we'll talk about in just a moment. On the back side, of course, we still have that little screw that's hidden on the caliper, and I'll show you how to adjust that here on the car as well. Before we do that though, let's come back here to the cable. So as I mentioned, there is some adjustment here. Unless you've removed your brake calipers or if you had another problem, you probably don't ever really need to mess with these cables. However, these cables do have some adjustment. So just to show you what you can do, basically these guys here, there's a nut on the outside and then a nut on the inside. and these are both 14 millimeters. And you can loosen this. There we go. Pro tip, come in here with a brush and get all of the dust and debris out, so that way it's easy to loosen these guys up. But now I've loosened this up, so there's actually some movement here in this cable. Now, you don't want this cable pulled so hard that you're actually pulling the arm, if I can get my finger over here, that you're actually pulling the arm on the back side. Because if you're doing that, you're squeezing the pads, and so you're going to have brake drag. So like here, just me pulling on the cable like this, it's really difficult to actually turn the brake rotor, and it's simpler without any tension. So you don't want this to be loosey-goosey floppy, but you also don't want it to be too tight. So when you're setting this adjustment, basically this guy comes in here. You want it to where it comfortably rests up against it, and you can see on this one it's actually basically bottomed out against the rest of the cable housing, and that's okay, because if I pull on it at all, I can actually feel the caliper squeezing. So where it is currently is actually just right. Again, if you aren't removing your caliper and have to take this off to service it, you probably never have to mess with this. But if you need a little bit more adjustment, you can get a little bit more adjustment here. And once you're all done, just tighten the nuts up against each other, just like that, easy peasy. Okay, so now on the back side here, I'm actually going to go underneath the car and get this nut loosened. And this might be a little bit difficult to see, I apologize. There we go. So this guy comes out the back, and look at this. This caliper has a crush washer on that bolt. So that is exactly how it's supposed to be. That way it's keeping as much of the dirt and junk out of there. And then I can take my 4mm Allen, and this guy, basically an extension, makes your life a little easier if you're not using a long Allen bolt. And come back around here. There we go. And reach back through. And I can basically, tightening it as if you're looking at the back of it, pushes the piston towards the outside of the car. So that causes it to clamp onto the rotor. So you can see I've tightened it, and I didn't put a lot of force on it, but I did just give it a little bit of a snug, and now I can't turn this rotor at all. So I know that that's the bottom point of the adjustment for what I want, but now I loosen it about 1/3 to 1/2 of a turn, and now I can easily turn the rotors again. If you can hear through the mic, there is a little bit of noise that you can hear the pads dragging against the rotors, and that's okay. Really what I'm looking for here is that so there isn't a lot of noticeable effort. You're going to notice that there is some effort to be able to turn the axles and the differential. You need to have your transmission in neutral. If you don't, this will be impossible to turn, or if you have your parking brake handle pulled in the car, it's not going to work. So make sure your parking brake handle is off. But basically, once you're at that point where this rotor can turn relatively freely, you can go back and double check if you want. Basically, turn it to where it's a little bit tight and you can't really turn it by hand. Back off about 1/3 to 1/2 of a turn. Check. Make sure that there isn't significant drag. Then you're done. Don't forget to put that little bolt back in. This guy, I don't know if I said it earlier, it's 14 millimeters. Okay. So, the other thing that I didn't mention, before you do any of this at the wheel, you should have the car up, have it out of gear, in neutral. Make sure the parking brake handle is down. You should also press your brake pedal a few times. That way, if you've just changed your pads and your pistons are not yet actually engaging the backside of the pads, you're taking up any slack. So make sure that if you've just done a brake job, it's usually why you need to set your parking brake adjustment anyway. Press your brakes 3, 4, 5 times, whatever. That way, those pistons are where they're supposed to be, and then the fine adjustment for your parking brake will not have a ton of adjustment where you have to spend a lot of time threading it in. So once you've done that, set the adjustment, go do the other side, and you're done. Easy peasy. So that's it for the at the wheel adjustment. For NAs and NBs, this is something that pretty straightforward as long as you're not dealing with really rusty, crusty stuff. On NCs and NDs, remember, this step isn't required. So now that we've done everything down here, let's look at the adjustment at the handle inside the car. We're going to do that actually over here on the NC because it's a little easier to get to. And it's basically the same for all 4 generations, or it's very, very similar looking. Hopefully you can see what's going on there a little bit. So down here, I've already pulled back the boot on your parking brake handle. And on NCs, this is really easy. If you have NA and B, if you have a ND, you actually have to remove the center console entirely, or at least most of it, so that way you can get access to it. Actually, I take that back. On NAs and NBs, there's a plastic surround with 1 screw in the middle. You take that little screw out, and then plastic inside separates from the plastic outside, and then it exposes this. But basically, on any generation Miata, this is what you're looking for. There's going to be a long threaded stud that's poking up, and then a 10 millimeter nut. So this nut is how you adjust the tension for the parking brake mechanism. I'm going to take a seat so that way I can pull this lever and show you what's going on. So right now, this car, NCs and NDs, if you have stock rear brakes, you probably don't need to touch this at all. And the reason being is that Mazda's specification on if the parking brake is working correctly, is that if you were to pull the parking brake handle, again, just with stock brakes, they specify they want you to pull at exactly 50 millimeters in from the end. So basically make sure you're pulling at the middle of the handle, not the top or the bottom. And then they want you to test with 22 pound-feet of force. And when you've reached 22 pound-feet of force, you should have 3 clicks. Now, I don't know many people that are going to have probably like a force gauge, you know, one of those pulley weight things. You could do that. Not many people are just going to have that handy. Basically, that's going to be very light pressure to pull it up 3 notches. That is properly adjusted according to factory spec on NCs and NDs. NAs, they don't do that because you have adjustment at the caliper, so you don't have to worry about this being as particular. NCs and NDs, basically, if you don't have that specification where you can lift it up 22 pound-feet and gets that 3 magic clicks, then you can adjust this, and it's as simple as using a deep socket 10 millimeter and basically tightening it to be able to give it more tension or loosening it to back off on that tension. Pretty simple there. For NAs, NBs, and NCs and NDs that have our little big brake kit or big brake kit with that power light caliper that I showed you earlier that doesn't have any adjustment at the caliper, it just has the arms that squeeze the pads together. This is really the only adjustment that you have now. So for those setups, or if you have the dual piston, dual caliper version, and you've already done the adjustment at the caliper and you need to do a little bit of adjustment here, you can. Basically, think of this as a secondary adjustment method if you have the dual caliper version, or if you have the only single caliper version, this is the primary adjustment. So same kind of thing, but on those ones, basically what we're looking for is moderate force to be able to pull this up, and you want to have basically full engagement by about 5 to 7 clicks. So 5 clicks is kind of on the good, like properly adjusted, you know, just on my brakes. But if you've been driving the car a little while and your pads have been wearing thinner, if you've got 6 or 7 clicks before it feels nice and firm, that's okay too, as long as it's actually working properly. But what you can do is have the car up in the air, just like the NB, and pull it 5 clicks. You can just count. And then from here, go back to the wheel, spin the rotor by hand. If you can, like easily, then you probably need more adjustment here. You should be able to more or less lock up that rear caliper, or at least it needs a ton of force to be able to turn that rear rotor if you're at 5 clicks here at the parking brake handle with one of our Wilwood brake kits. With a stock brake system on an NA or NB, basically 5 clicks, you should be pretty much also engaging with the rear, but again, on those ones, just use the adjustment at the rear caliper. It's going to make a much bigger difference to your adjustment compared to adjusting here at the handle. But that adjustment procedure is the same for all 4 generations. It just looks a little different. You know, you might have a parking brake handle on this side versus this side, but look for the long threaded rod, use a 10mm deep socket, and that's it. Bob's your auntie. Okay, so that's my spiel. And I think, for the most part, that should cover most folks. Do we have any questions that I should address before I sign off? I do. Okay, let me come back over here. All right, what questions do we have to talk about?
If you need to readjust your parking brake, do you adjust the calipers first and then the parking brake, or the parking brake and then the calipers on an NB Miata?
So what order should I adjust all of the things, basically? If you have an NA and B, where it has all of this stuff on the back with the splines and that kind of thing, always start with your adjustment at the caliper. You have much more control, and especially you have much more control left and right individually before your adjustment at the handle. The parking brake handle, when you pull that guy, there is a T-bar underneath in the transmission tunnel, where basically that parking brake handle has a cable and then a bar and then the 2 cables that go out to each wheel. So you want to make sure that you do them at the wheels or at the calipers first, because that way you can ensure that your left-right clamping force is correct and even left to right before you do the handle, if there's any kind of adjustment that needs to happen there. So always start at the calipers if you have an NA or NB with stock brakes. Do we have any other questions? Okay, all right. So hopefully this was helpful. Basically, I wanted to cover a relatively straightforward DIY for most folks. This is stuff that's easily within regular maintenance for anybody changing their brake pads, or if you needed to pull a caliper off for other reasons. That basically, this is pretty standard for anybody who's doing anything other than maybe changing their shift knobs, you know. But I wanted to cover it because it's something we do get questions about. There aren't that many other DIYs on YouTube that I found that were as in-depth about all 4 generations plus some aftermarket stuff. So hopefully this is a good resource for you. If you like this kind of content, of course, like, subscribe. You know, we try to do this kind of stuff often when we can, and we'll try to do more as time goes on. Oh, actually, you know what? I thought of one more thing. We did get a question in advance about parking brake cables and what to do or how to tell if they're stretched. So before I finish, let's talk about that. Parking brake cables, you know, this one is an aftermarket one, but the factory parking brake cables, let's just say I haven't actually seen one stretch. I've heard of people saying that they stretch their cables, and I suppose it's possible, but it's really, really unlikely. The factory parking brake cables are very strong. They're very well built for the most part. If you live somewhere that it's rusty, like if you got salt issues, you know, they salt the road, whatever, what may happen is that the salt eventually gets into your parking brake cable, so in between the cable, like the metal cable, and the sheath itself, and it will corrode and wear, and then you'll have a point where basically that salt or grit or whatever actually eats away enough to where it'll snap the cable. That does happen. I've had issues where I've actually gotten ice up in the cable, so I'd set the parking brake overnight, and then in the morning I couldn't put it down, or basically I could put the lever down, but the caliper was still stuck clamped. You heat it up or let it warm up, you know, and then the water or the ice melts into water, and then you can move everything and it's fine. I've heard of those kinds of issues, but stretching a factory cable is nearly impossible from what I can tell. What usually happens when people say, I think I stretched my cable, is usually the mechanism inside your piston has failed. So even on NAs and NBs, there is basically like a spiral style adjustment mechanical function inside the piston itself. And this should have a mechanism that when you set your adjustment in the back of the caliper, it should stay there. Basically, it shouldn't have a mechanism to be able to undo its adjustment. But if this has an internal issue where basically the ratcheting teeth, if you will, either break, wear down, whatever, I have seen some where this is the fault. And once you either rebuild your caliper and replace this piston, or swap to a new caliper with one that's still good, that fixes the issue. You can always pull your cables out of the car and measure your left to right. NAs and NBs are the same length, and Cs and NDs aren't. But I, again, almost guarantee you it's probably not your stock cable. If you have an aftermarket cable, they are definitely built to a different standard. These ones that we have built nowadays are very strong. We haven't had really any issues with them. There have been previous versions of these cables from a different manufacturer that we've had issues where they would pull the heads off or have, stretching issues, whatever, you name it. So not all aftermarket cables are built to the same specification. So your mileage may vary on aftermarket stuff, but for stock stuff, it's probably okay for the most part. I think that was the only question we got in advance, so I'll leave it there for now, unless anything else has come in while I've been yammering. No? Okay. So again, if I didn't answer your question because you're watching this after the fact, drop us a comment down below and we'll answer you later. But otherwise, I really appreciate everybody's attention watching this. Hopefully you learned something. Drop us some suggestions on what you'd like me to talk about next time for technical how-tos, DIYs, whatever. If it's something that we think is valuable to show the community and have that resource out there, we like to be able to put these videos out for everybody to use and have reference for. So thanks again. We really appreciate it, and we will see you all next time.